Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on UATV and I'm Alice Gerjuk. Following the NATO Summit in Wales back in 2014, the members of Alliance decided to take a number of steps aiming to help Ukraine better provide for its security. One of these steps was the creation of the C4 Trust Fund, meaning command, control, communications and computers. To learn more about how this fund operates, we are joined in the studio today by Gerard Elzinga, branch head of the Spectrum and C3 Infrastructure branch of the NATO Headquarters C3 Staff. Hello and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, likewise.
So the Trust Fund was created back in 2014 and aimed at helping Ukraine, as I said, to boost its defense sector. How would you evaluate the changes within this 4 years of work?
Well, the Trust Fund, as you said, started in 2014. It was effectively first a feasibility study was conducted where we assess the situation as it was in Ukraine, come up with some recommendations that resulted in project proposals for the Trust Fund. Of those projects, 3 are now under implementation, or implementation will start soon. I'll come back to that later. Mm-hmm. And in the progress that we have seen, there is a significant, let's say, advance in adopting NATO's views. NATO as in an alliance of 29 nations, providing the best practices that we have learned over the course of the years. And by seeing that Ukraine is slowly but definitely surely adhering to our standards, trying to implement those standards, trying to understand our concepts, our doctrine, and how to implement those in the best ways.
Could you be more specific about it? Because we do know that Ukraine has launched this course to develop its armed forces and all the security forces to be compliant with NATO standards by 2020. Yep. What is the feedback basically? What are the results so far?
The results as we see them, specifically from a C4 perspective, because the Trust Fund is limited to C4. I mean, we're not talking armaments or other stuff. This is C4. There is definitely eagerness to take into account the standards. And with the standard, I want to emphasize, it's not only a technical standard that will be implemented. It's also our ways of working, our doctrine that are also covered by standards. So C4 standards is wider than just technical aspects, and we just sense that the advices we give are taken to heart by Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, the situation in Ukraine is different than in any other NATO nation, and not all NATO nations are the same. But by implementing a standard, adopting it to your local situation, you at least ensure a minimum level of interoperability with other nations within NATO, within operations, within a coalition operation. And that is what we're seeing, and the effect is extremely positive. But of course, you can't expect a nation that has been working in a specific situation for decades to change overnight to a completely different system, and also change their systems and capacities overnight and all of a sudden be fully 100% interoperable. That's the same thing as in NATO nations. Not all NATO nations are equally interoperable with each other, but at least we ensure a minimum level of interoperability by which we can operate effectively and efficiently together.
But what mechanisms does the Trust Fund use in order to evaluate what changes are needed here in Ukraine?
Well, as said, we had performed the feasibility study, which started in 2014, right after the summit. So the actual work, the summit was in September. The actual work on the C4 Trust Fund feasibility study started in December. So we conducted the first visits. That resulted in a report where we assessed what kind of projects could be best suited, let's say, or would be best suited to improve the command and control capabilities, the C4 capabilities of Ukraine. So increase and improve its capabilities and ensure interoperability with NATO.
And what are
there
they?
were 4 projects identified in that. One of them that's currently been ongoing for a year and a half now is the knowledge sharing project. 2 others are currently being, or implementation will start. Approval has been granted for those 2 projects, and implementation will start expected timelines is September, October to really have the, call it the boots on the ground to initiate the projects in Ukraine.
And what are these two projects about? The first one is knowledge sharing.
Knowledge sharing, which the word in itself is what it is all about. Share NATO knowledge as, let's say, the collective knowledge and best practices of NATO and NATO nations and provide that to Ukraine. The second one is the Regional Airspace Security Program, which allows the integration of civil and military air traffic information, combine it and as such provide a complete air picture, call it a recognized air picture, of all the air traffic that is coming into Ukraine, going out to Ukraine, and what is over Ukraine. Now, this is a project for which already a feasibility study was launched and a demonstration was provided. The Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Ukrainian Air Traffic Control, because it's a military-civil cooperation, were very enthusiastic about it. Project proposal further developed, and it is now also approved by the Trust Fund, by the lead nations of the Trust Fund. And the secure communications is about providing a communications capability for your armed forces, a secure communications capability. So communications that cannot be intercepted, well, they can be intercepted but cannot be understood because it's encrypted. As well as with a tracking, what we call a blue force tracking system, and that will be handed out to your armed forces to allow for secure communications when involved in operations and in exercises. This equipment has been tested recently, I think it was last week, during Operation Sea Breeze, an operation in the Black Sea.
Yes.
And the people that have evaluated it were very enthusiastic about it. So the Trust Fund will deliver this equipment over the next months, and we will start discussing let's say, the details of that delivery and how to employ them and to provide the training over the next months.
Also, there is a lot of work being done to strengthen Ukraine's, well, the capabilities of Ukraine's armed forces.
Yes, but not only, I must also state that it's not only the NATO C3 Trust Fund that provides support. There's also a lot of bilateral support from other nations, NATO nations, the United States, Canada. They have also provided support bilaterally already to Ukraine. And one of the things that we also aim to do with our projects is to align and deconflict and not duplicate efforts, of course, in that. So we do communicate, coordinate with other nations to see, okay, well, if something is already done, we're not going to do the same thing over again. That doesn't make sense. So to make an as effective and efficient use of our resources, because the resources of the Trust Fund are limited. It depends on contributions from NATO nations.
Well, earlier, Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister on Euro integration, Ivana Klimpurstyn-Tsatsa, has stated that NATO Ukraine Trust Fund is going to review its work for some changes. So are the priorities shifting? And if yes, where do they shift now?
Well, our priorities are in that sense, for the Trust Fund itself, they're not shifting. We focus on the armed forces. It's a broader context. In that sense, it's armed forces and security services. In the hackathon that is being held this week, you also see participation of your security forces, like the emergency services, the security services. But our focus and number one priority remain the armed forces.
But what about social adaptation after? Well, I mean, probably she meant this. It was a conversation about war veterans and their social adaptation. Is this being included in the program of changes of the Trust Fund?
No,
for
this
Ukraine?
is not.
We have
the thing is, we define a specific scope for our Trust Fund that's being approved. That scope in the whole project proposal is being approved by the lead nations, and we stick with the scope of the projects that have been defined and agreed. Of course, if there would be changes needed for whatever reason, and also in discussion with Ukraine, if they would like us to go in certain directions with our project proposal or with our projects, we will have to bring that back to the lead nations and get their approval. The lead nations, being Germany, Canada, and United Kingdom, they decide at the end of the day what we are allowed to do and within what scope, taking into account all their criteria and whatever, let's say, conditions they put on the execution of the project.
And how does the Trust Fund follow up on Ukraine's changes?
In terms of within the scope of the trust fund, you mean?
Yeah.
Well,
after some work being done, I mean.
After some work's being done, we of course report back. We have regular meetings with the lead nations on it. We provide them with with the feedback, how we perceive what is being achieved, make an assessment on the outcome of our discussions and our advice in the workshops given to Ukraine. Also, this is done in conjunction with our Ukrainian counterparts, who then indicate, okay, well, we would like to have something more of this, something more of that. If it's within the scope of the project, of course, we have some flexibility in that. We will put our emphasis on requests made by Ukraine. We definitely want to provide something to Ukraine that is worthwhile to them. And it's done in conjunction and in concert with what Ukraine desires are within, let's say, the flexibility that we have within projects. So, for example, if there would be more interest in having additional information on how to approach information management, then we will see whether we can provide more information on that and provide specific experts to help out with any specific issues that the Ukrainian armed forces and security service may have. So in that sense, there is definitely a follow-up. It's not like we deliver something and after that it's like, okay, we delivered it, done deal, next one. We definitely engage in a very active discussion with our Ukrainian counterparts within the MOD, General Staff and security services. Because at the end of the day, if you don't meet your customer requirements, then it doesn't really make much sense. But still keeping in mind that we would like to bring across how within NATO we do business, because based on the best practices, and also to ensure that the Ukrainian approaches are becoming interoperable and better interoperable with NATO. So we provide them, that's why also we provide them our standards, but also the access to our experts. So,
and is the time frame of this cooperation with Trust Fund unlimited, or does it have some certain deadline?
It is limited because the major supplier of the, let's say, the Trust Fund to execute the Trust Fund is the NCI agency. The NCI agency is customer funded, and that means that when the budget of the Trust Fund has ended, then of course the projects will be terminated at some moment in time. But we do try to, within the budgets, to have a clear ending, to provide a full product and not just provide something which we can't finish. In that sense, the knowledge sharing project, for example, would normally finish by the end of 2018, early 2019. But in the meantime, we're also aiming to obtain additional funding, or within the trust fund, that's the intent. And also to see if we can, let's say, of the remaining funding, continue to use that, and we'll come up with proposals for that, to continue and finish some projects so that you have a logical and clear end state, and not that we just end up somewhere in the middle, because that would not lead to the, let's say, foreseen and projected results, where we aim to improve the C4 capabilities of Ukraine. And of course, through regular interaction, whether or not through the agency, but definitely also through NATO headquarters, because in engaging with the Ukrainian armed forces, in engaging through the structures, the committee structures within NATO headquarters, we also can continue to engage Ukrainian representatives, and we can continue to provide support like we would provide to any NATO nations in terms of advice or providing information or things like that. So there will always be interaction, but not within the context of the C4 Trust Fund. Now, when the projects are finished, once the secure communications project, where we provide the secure communications equipment, once that is delivered, that project comes to an end as a project for the agency. But the capability, the system itself, comes with a unlimited or with a limited airtime, that it can use the system. but with unlimited data exchange over the system. And that is, in that period, they will still be able to use that system. And then it's up to the Ukraine to decide whether they want to continue with that project, whether expand the number of terminals, whether expand and continue with the airtime. That's one thing they could do. For the RASP, same thing. We will provide through the project the Regional Airspace Security Program. So we will provide that capability with nodes on the ground, so centers on the ground that can then see the civil military air traffic and have a continuous overview of what is going on in the airspace. But once it's delivered, it comes, of course, with a certain warranty and support for a time, as with any normal delivery. But after that, it is a system of the Ukraine, and it's up to the Ukraine to continue using it and to continue investing or expanding or whatever they want to do with it. But from a trust fund perspective, effectively, once the trust fund has finished the funds, when the budget is spent, then the trust fund will effectively cease to exist.
Of course. Well,
of course, the structures are still in place, and if there will be, let's say, in the future, contributions from nations to provide for the trust fund, it can restart it. We can continue with perhaps with some of the projects, or we can restart some of the projects, or come up with a new project.
Well, since the funding is not spent yet,
not yet. No, unfortunately not.
Yes, let's hope that Ukraine's defense sector will improve as much as possible from this cooperation. And thank you for your contribution for that. Thanks for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was Gerard Elzinga, branch head of the Spectrum and C3 Infrastructure branch of NATO Headquarters C3 Staff. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I am Alles Gerjuk. Goodbye.